There are moments in life when nothing dramatic happens. No loud failures, no sudden victories, just a quiet weight that settles in your chest. Days pass, effort continues, and still the summit feels far away. In those moments, motivation whispers instead of shouting, and discipline becomes a lonely companion. This is a story about that quiet space, about the strength it takes to keep going when no one is watching, about healing that arrives slowly, disguised as routine, about how transformation is rarely a single leap, but a series of invisible steps. In a small mountain town where mornings smelled of frost and stone, there lived a man named Elias Moreno. He believed that purpose was earned one breath at a time. This is his journey, and perhaps in some quiet way it is yours too. Elias Moreno woke before the sun, not because he wanted to, but because his body had learned the language of discipline. The small cabin where he lived sat at the edge of a mountain town that most maps forgot to name. From his window, peaks rose like quiet witnesses, patient, unmoved, eternal. Every morning Elias greeted them in silence. He moved through his routine with practiced precision. Water boiled, boots laced, jacket zipped. There was comfort in repetition, a strange kind of peace in knowing exactly what came next. Discipline had been his anchor for years. When emotions felt unreliable, habit stayed loyal. When motivation faded, routine remained. To Elias, consistency was not a choice. It was survival. He was a mountain climber by profession, but more than that, he was a man who believed that progress was built quietly. No shortcuts, no bursts of inspiration, just effort, repeated until it shaped you. While others waited for motivation, Elias trusted discipline. He trusted the slow burn. He trusted the journey. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived a restlessness he rarely named. As he trained alone on narrow trails, breath rising in steady clouds, his mind stayed focused on steps and rhythm. One foot, then the other. The mountains had taught him that hesitation was dangerous. You either moved forward or you slipped. There was no room for doubt on a cliff face. Still, somewhere deep inside, Elias felt a subtle tension, like a rope pulled too tight. He had been climbing for years, chasing summits not for glory but for meaning. Each ascent promised clarity. Each peak whispered that the next one would finally make him whole. Discipline had given him strength, resilience, and respect, but it had not given him peace. People in town admired him quietly. They spoke of his dedication, his discipline, his motivation. Few knew him well. Elias didn't linger in conversations. He didn't know how to rest without feeling guilty. Stillness made him uneasy. Silence off the mountain felt too loud. And if you're honest with yourself, you may recognize this feeling. That moment when your life looks stable on the outside, but inside, something feels unfinished. When discipline keeps you moving, but you're not sure where you're going anymore. When strength becomes armor and armor becomes weight. Elias believed that stopping meant falling behind, that rest was weakness, that slowing down would unravel everything he had built. So he kept climbing, he kept training, he kept pushing forward, even when his heart quietly asked for something softer. On the wall of his cabin hung a faded photograph of a summit taken years ago. He rarely looked at it. Achievements once earned quickly lost their power over him. The next mountain always waited. As the sun finally rose, painting the peaks in pale gold, Elias paused on the trail. Just for a moment. His breath slowed. The wind moved past him without urgency. The mountains were not rushing. They never had. He tightened his grip on the straps of his pack and continued upward, because Elias did not yet know that discipline, when disconnected from purpose, can quietly turn into a cage. He did not yet know that consistency without compassion leads to exhaustion, not transformation. But every journey, every true journey, begins long before the summit. It begins with the weight of the first step. Elias Moreno lived his days like a metronome, steady, precise, unyielding. Each morning mirrored the last, and each climb followed a rhythm he had perfected over years of discipline. There was comfort in knowing what to expect from himself. No surprises, no excuses, just progress, measured not in applause, but in endurance. The mountain became his calendar. Weather patterns replaced dates. Altitude replaced milestones. His body adapted, hardened by repetition. Muscles learned the quiet language of effort. Breath learned patience. Pain became familiar, almost friendly. It reminded him that he was alive, that he was moving forward. Small victories stacked silently, an extra mile without stopping, a steeper incline conquered, a route once feared, now climbed with calm precision. Elias never celebrated these moments. Celebration felt indulgent, unnecessary. Success to him was simply proof that discipline was working. In the town below, life moved at a softer pace. People gathered in cafes. Laughter drifted through open windows. Elias passed through like a shadow, polite but distant. His purpose lived higher, above the noise, where clarity felt closer and expectations felt lighter. When people asked why he climbed, Elias gave simple answers. Because it's there. Because it keeps me sharp. But the truth was quieter. He climbed because consistency gave him identity. It told him who he was when nothing else did. In a world that often felt uncertain, discipline was something he could control. Every completed routine whispered reassurance. You are still strong. You are still moving. Yet even as his skills sharpened, something subtle began to crack beneath the surface. Elias began planning a major ascent, a peak known not for its beauty, but for its refusal to be conquered easily. It was the kind of mountain climbers spoke about with lowered voices, unforgiving, unpredictable, honest. To reach its summit required not just strength, but unwavering discipline. The idea consumed him. He trained harder, woke earlier, rested less. The line between dedication and obsession blurred slowly, almost invisibly. If he felt tired, he pushed through. If his body asked for rest, he answered with more effort. Discipline had always rewarded him before. Why would it fail now? As weeks passed, his life narrowed. Meals became fuel, not pleasure. Sleep became strategy, not rest. Conversations became distractions. Everything that did not serve the climb was quietly removed, and still, progress continued. His confidence grew, not loud or arrogant, but firm. He trusted his systems. He trusted his consistency. He trusted that effort, repeated often enough, could overcome anything. If you've ever believed that staying busy would protect you from pain, you understand Elias. If you've ever chased purpose through productivity, you've walked his path. The mountain loomed closer now, its peak often hidden behind shifting clouds. Elias studied it the way some study mirrors, searching for meaning, testing himself against its silence. He imagined the summit not as triumph, but as relief, a place where the constant push might finally soften. One evening, as he packed his gear, Elias felt a rare flicker of hesitation. A question surfaced uninvited. What happens after this climb? He dismissed it quickly. Questions slowed momentum. Doubt had no place in discipline. He tightened his pack straps and folded the thought away. Because success, as Elias defined it, was simple. Keep going. Don't stop. Don't look back. He did not yet see the flaw hiding inside that belief. He did not yet understand that consistency, when fueled by fear, eventually leads to collapse. But the mountain was waiting, and soon it would answer him. The morning Elias Moreno began the ascent, the sky was neither kind nor cruel. It was indifferent. Clouds drifted without intention, and the mountain stood as it always had, silent, unmoved by ambition. Elias preferred it that way. He trusted neutrality more than encouragement. Each step felt familiar, controlled, earned. His body moved with the confidence of repetition, muscles responding without hesitation. This was what years of discipline were for. To meet moments like this with calm certainty. The first hours passed smoothly. The trail narrowed, air thinned, and the world below slowly disappeared. Elias welcomed the isolation. Up here, expectations faded. There was only the climb, the breath, the next hold. But mountains have their own language. And that day, it spoke in subtle warnings. The wind shifted without rhythm. Clouds thickened, swallowing distance. The rock felt colder, less forgiving. Elias noticed these signs, but he trusted his preparation more than instinct. He had trained for this. He had earned this. So he continued. As elevation increased, fatigue arrived earlier than expected. Not sharp or dramatic, just a quiet heaviness in his limbs. Elias tightened his focus. Discipline demanded persistence. Pain, after all, was temporary. Then, without spectacle, the mountain changed its mind. A section of ice, thinner than anticipated, gave way beneath his weight. It wasn't a violent fall, just a sudden loss of certainty. Elias caught himself, heart pounding, breath ragged. He hung there for a moment, suspended between effort and consequence. This was the first time fear touched him. He adjusted, recalculated, and climbed on. Turning back felt unthinkable. Discipline had brought him here. Discipline would take him through. But the higher he went, the more the mountain resisted. Not aggressively, but honestly. Conditions worsened. Visibility shrank. His breathing grew shallow, uneven. His body, once obedient, began asking questions he didn't want to answer. Still, Elias pushed. Because stopping would mean admitting that consistency was not enough. The final stretch came sooner than expected, but so did the breaking point. His grip slipped again, this time more violently. Pain shot through his arm. His pack shifted. For a brief, terrifying moment, the mountain stripped away every illusion of control. Elias fell. Not far, not fatally, but enough. Enough to shatter the narrative he had built for years. He landed hard against the rock, breath knocked from his chest. Time slowed, sound faded. The mountain did not react. It did not punish. It simply existed, unchanged by his effort. Lying there, Elias felt something unfamiliar spread through him. Not just pain, but disbelief. How could this happen? I did everything right. The climb was over. Not because the summit was unreachable, but because his body had reached its limit. With shaking hands, Elias secured himself and signaled for assistance. The descent that followed was slow, quiet, heavy with unspoken truth. Back on solid ground, wrapped in stillness, Elias stared at the peak now hidden entirely by clouds. The mountain had refused him, not with anger, but with honesty. And in that refusal, something inside him collapsed. His discipline had failed him. His consistency had not saved him. The identity he had built around effort alone cracked open. If you've ever experienced a moment where everything you trusted stopped working, you know this feeling. When the system you believed in breaks and you're left with nothing but questions. Elias returned to his cabin with more than bruises. He carried doubt. He carried shame. He carried a quiet grief for the man he thought discipline had made him. That night, the mountains were invisible beyond his window. For the first time in years, Elias did not wake early the next morning. Because when the mountain refused him, it wasn't the fall that hurt the most. It was the realization that effort alone does not guarantee arrival. Elias Moreno woke late the next morning, not because his body needed rest, but because his mind refused to move. The familiar pull of routine was gone. No urgency, no rhythm, just a heavy stillness pressing against his chest. The mountain stood outside his window again, unchanged, indifferent, towering. It looked the same as it always had. That somehow made everything worse. He replayed the climb in his head with obsessive precision. Every step, every decision, every moment where he could have done something differently. His mind searched desperately for a mistake small enough to fix, something that would allow him to believe the failure was an exception, not a truth. If I had rested more, if I had started earlier, if I had pushed harder. Denial is rarely loud. It is quiet, methodical, convincing. Elias refused to accept that the mountain had simply said no. He refused to believe that discipline, his greatest virtue, could also be his blind spot. So he clung tighter to his routines, to his rules, to the version of himself that never stopped. He returned to training before his body had healed. Pain became proof of loyalty. Exhaustion became evidence of commitment. Every ache felt like a debt he needed to repay. Discipline, once a source of motivation, hardened into punishment. The days blurred together. Elias moved through them mechanically, like a man trying to outrun a shadow. He avoided people, avoided questions. Silence felt safer than explanation. In the town, whispers followed him gently. Concern, not judgment, but Elias heard only accusation. He felt exposed, as if failure had marked him permanently. So he climbed smaller routes, faster, harder, trying to erase the memory of the fall through repetition. But the mountains felt different now. They no longer offered clarity. They reflected his tension back at him. Each step carried an undercurrent of fear. Fear of stopping, fear of weakness, fear that without discipline there would be nothing left. And maybe you know this place too. That moment when letting go feels more dangerous than holding on. When you grip an old version of yourself so tightly that it starts to hurt. When consistency becomes a way to avoid grief instead of moving through it. At night, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cabin. The quiet no longer comforted him. It pressed in, asking questions he didn't want to answer. Who are you if you slow down? What remains when effort fails? He ignored them all. Instead, he planned another attempt. Not because his body was ready, not because conditions were right, but because turning back felt like surrender. And surrender, in Elias's world, was unacceptable. He tightened his routines further. Less sleep, more miles, more control. He believed that if he could just return to the mountain and conquer it quickly, the doubt would disappear. But deep down, something had shifted. Discipline without compassion had hollowed him out. He was consistent, yes, but joyless, focused, but disconnected, strong, but brittle. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, Elias stood still on a trail he had climbed countless times. His breath came hard. His legs trembled, not from effort, but from resistance. For the first time, he wondered, not with fear, but with fatigue. What if holding on is what's breaking me? The thought lingered, uncomfortable and quiet. And though Elias pushed it aside, it planted a seed. Because sometimes the hardest part of transformation is not the fall. It is realizing that the way you survived once may not be the way you heal now. Elias Moreno stopped going to the mountains, not suddenly, not dramatically. He simply didn't go one morning, then another. And then the silence grew legs and followed him through the days. The boot stayed by the door, untouched. The ropes lay coiled like memories he wasn't ready to revisit. Without the climb, time stretched differently. Mornings arrived without purpose. The rhythm that once guided him dissolved, leaving behind an unfamiliar emptiness. Elias sat at the small wooden table in his cabin, watching steam rise from a cup of untouched coffee. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was confrontational. He had built his life around motion, around discipline, around forward momentum. And now, with nothing to chase, the weight of everything he had avoided began to settle in. He avoided the town, avoided the trails, avoided his own reflection. His body healed, but his spirit did not follow. Strength without direction became heaviness. Motivation without meaning became noise. Days passed where he spoke to no one. At night, Elias stepped outside and looked up at the peaks hidden behind clouds. He felt smaller than ever before, not humbled, just empty. The mountains had always been his mirror. Now they reflected nothing back. This was the lowest point. Not because something was taken from him, but because everything he used to rely on stopped working. If you've ever reached a moment where even your strongest habits can't save you, you understand this silence. When failure doesn't scream, it whispers. When the world doesn't collapse, but your inner structure quietly gives way. Elias questioned everything. Was his discipline real strength, or just fear in uniform? Had he been climbing toward purpose, or running from stillness? These questions didn't arrive with answers. They arrived with exhaustion. One afternoon, he sat on the floor of his cabin, back against the wall, and let the weight finally land. No training, no planning, no correcting, just breath, just presence. It was the first time in years he allowed himself to stop without explanation. Tears came without drama, no sobbing, no breakdown, just release. A slow, quiet acknowledgement of loss, not just of the climb, but of the identity he had wrapped around it. Elias realized something then, not intellectually, but emotionally. Failure hadn't broken him. Refusing to feel it had. The silence did not offer solutions, but it created space, and in that space, something fragile became possible. Not strength, not motivation, honesty. As night fell, the clouds lifted briefly, revealing the peaks bathed in moonlight. Elias watched them without longing, without pressure. For the first time, he did not feel the need to conquer them. He simply existed beneath them. And though he didn't know it yet, this was the moment before change becomes possible. The pause before rebirth. The breath held before release. Because sometimes healing doesn't begin with action. It begins with allowing yourself to be still long enough to hear what your life has been trying to tell you. Elias Moreno did not plan the walk. It happened the way gentle things often do, without intention, without expectation. One morning, restless but no longer desperate, he stepped outside his cabin and followed a narrow trail that curved along the lower ridge. It was not a climb. There were no ropes, no altitude goals, just a path meant for walking. The air was cool. Pine needles softened each step. Elias moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid that effort itself might return and take over again. Halfway along the trail, he noticed someone sitting on a fallen log. An older man, wrapped in a worn jacket, hands resting calmly on a wooden walking stick. He wasn't looking at the mountains. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was simply there. Elias hesitated, then nodded politely as he passed. "Beautiful day," the man said quietly. Elias stopped. The words weren't remarkable, but the tone was unhurried, unmeasured. No demand, no performance. "It is," Elias replied, surprised by how long it had been since he'd spoken to a stranger. They stood there for a moment, sharing the quiet. "You climb," the man said, not as a question. "I used to," Elias answered. The man smiled faintly. "Mountains have a way of teaching us even when we stop listening." Elias felt something shift inside him. Not resistance, not defense, just attention. They sat together on the log. The man did not ask about the fall, did not ask about discipline or goals or recovery. He spoke instead of small things. The way trails change after storms, how trees grow stronger by bending, not resisting. After a while, Elias asked, "How do you know when to keep going and when to stop?" The man considered this, tapping his stick gently against the ground. "You don't," he said. "Not with your head. You know with your relationship to effort. If effort feels like respect, continue. If it feels like punishment, rest." The words landed softly, but deeply. Elias realized no one had ever framed discipline that way before. Not as control, not as toughness, but as respect. The man stood, adjusted his jacket. "Consistency isn't about proving anything," he added. "It's about showing up without violence toward yourself." Then he nodded once and walked on, disappearing around the bend as quietly as he had arrived. Elias remained seated long after. That encounter did not change his life in a single moment. It did not ignite motivation or erase pain, but it did something more important. It gave him permission to begin again, differently. Because sometimes transformation doesn't arrive through force or intensity. It arrives through a quiet voice on a trail, reminding you that strength and kindness were never meant to be enemies. Elias Moreno did not return to the mountains the next day. Instead, he woke early and did something unfamiliar. He listened, not to ambition, not to fear, but to his body, to the subtle signals he had trained himself to ignore for years. He stretched slowly, drank water without rushing, stepped outside and let the morning air settle on his skin. There was no plan, no target, just presence. For the first time, consistency was not about control. It was about care. Elias began small, walks instead of climbs, breath instead of pace. He set no goals except one, to show up without harm. Discipline softened. It stopped demanding proof and started offering structure. Some days all he did was walk the same short path and return home. And surprisingly, that was enough. Healing, he learned, does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as simplicity. As weeks passed, Elias rebuilt his routines, but this time they were lighter, flexible, forgiving. Rest was not something to earn, it was something to honor. Failure was not a threat, it was information. The mountains waited patiently. When Elias finally returned to a gentle slope, there was no urgency in his steps. He climbed not to conquer, but to reconnect. The familiar rhythm returned, but it felt different now, less sharp, more alive. He noticed things he had missed before. The sound of wind moving through stone, the way shadows shifted slowly across the trail, the steady wisdom of the terrain. Discipline, he realized, was never meant to be a weapon against himself. It was meant to be a bridge between who he was and who he was becoming. And if you're listening closely, this is where your journey overlaps with his. Because beginning again is rarely dramatic. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't promise instant transformation. It simply invites you to take one honest step forward. Elias still felt doubt, still felt fear, but they no longer ruled him. They walked beside him, quieter now, less threatening. This was rebirth, not a sudden awakening, but a gradual return to self-respect. And though the summit still existed, it no longer defined him. The journey itself had begun to feel like purpose. Healing did not erase Elias Moreno's old instincts. They waited. For weeks his new rhythm held. Slow climbs, gentle mornings, rest without guilt. The quiet satisfaction of consistency rooted in care, not control. He felt steadier, clearer, almost peaceful. Almost. Then one morning, standing halfway up a familiar ridge, Elias felt it. The old pull. The urge to go faster, to push harder, to prove that he was back. His breath felt strong, his legs responsive. The mountain seemed to invite him upward with the same silent challenge it always had. Just a little more, the voice whispered. Just to see if you can. This is how old habits return. Not as enemies, but as temptations disguised as confidence. Elias paused. His heart rate rose. Not from effort, but from memory. He remembered the fall, the obsession, the hollow exhaustion. He remembered how easily discipline had turned into self-erasure, but he also remembered something else. Respect. Strength, he now understood, was not about how far you could push. It was about knowing when not to. He took a breath and chose restraint, not because he was afraid, but because he was aware. Awareness was the new discipline. Consistency was no longer about intensity. It was about honesty. And yet the struggle didn't vanish. There were days when impatience crept in, days when progress felt slow and insignificant, days when Elias questioned whether gentleness would ever be enough. If you've ever changed your life, you know this stage well, the moment when transformation is tested not by crisis but by boredom, by the temptation to return to what once felt powerful, even if it hurt. Elias stayed. He stayed with the slow pace, with the discomfort of not proving anything, with the humility of unfinished growth. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The urge to rush lost its grip, not because Elias fought it, but because he didn't feed it. Each time he chose consistency over intensity, he rewired his relationship with effort. He was no longer climbing to escape himself. He was climbing to meet himself. That shift changed everything. Elias Moreno reached the mountain again, not the one that had turned him back, but another, quieter, less famous, the kind of summit that didn't demand recognition to feel complete. The climb took longer than it once would have. He stopped often, not from weakness, but from awareness. Each pause was intentional. Each breath felt earned, not forced. When he finally reached the top, there was no surge of adrenaline, no rush of victory, just a wide, open stillness. The world stretched out below him, valleys layered in soft light, rivers moving without urgency, clouds drifting with no destination. Elias stood there and realized something profound. This felt better than triumph ever had. There was no pressure to capture the moment, no need to prove anything to anyone. The summit was not an ending. It was a conversation between effort and acceptance, between discipline and peace. Elias sat and let the mountain be what it was. He did not try to own it. He did not measure it. He respected it, and for the first time he respected himself in the same way. Purpose, he understood now, was not a peak you reached once. It was a relationship you maintained through consistency, through patience, through letting go of who you thought you had to be. He descended slowly, smiling without knowing why. Because the mountain had given him something far greater than success. It had given him balance. And now, the story turns to you. Because somewhere in your life, there is a mountain you are facing. Maybe it looks like a career, a habit, a relationship, or a version of yourself you're trying to outgrow. And maybe, like Elias, you believe that discipline means pushing harder, holding tighter, never stopping. But listen carefully. Discipline is not about punishment. Consistency is not about proving worth. Failure is not the opposite of strength. It is often the doorway to it. Sometimes healing begins when you stop forcing progress and start honoring pace. When you learn that letting go does not mean giving up. It means making room. When courage shows up not as intensity but as restraint. Your journey does not require perfection. It requires presence. Transformation happens quietly, one honest step at a time. So if today feels slow, let it be slow. If rest feels uncomfortable, stay with it. If the old urge to rush returns, notice it and choose again. Because the most powerful kind of motivation is not loud. It is consistent. It is kind. And it is patient enough to wait for you to become who you already are. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, to reflect, and when you're ready, continue your journey, steadily, respectfully, and in your own time. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, remember to like, share, and subscribe.